Hello everyone, my name is Chris Bex. I'm with the Remnant Trust here at Texas Tech, specifically here in the Southwest Special Collections Building. And thank you all for coming. We're very excited about having our first student scholar presentation with Brett here in a couple months. And first I want to say a few thank yous, not only to Texas Tech University for having the Remnant Trust here, but also for our Faculty Advisory Council. There's at least one person here representing them. They help us put this together, help find the candidates to put the presentation and do some of the research, so we appreciate that. Also, the Helen Jones Foundation here locally has made it possible for us to do some of these activities, so we're appreciative of that as well. And I'll introduce Brett just a bit about him that mostly I've learned here recently. He and I just met today, but I know he's been doing this research for much of the semester. He has a BA in Biblical Studies. He has a Master's in Humanities right from the University of Dallas.
Yes.
That's right, and also has a graduate degree from the University of Oxford. And I'm particularly interested in hearing what he has to say about Petrus Comestor. It's a piece that we've had in the Remnant Trust collection for many, many years, but we only know a little bit about it. It's also interesting to see what some of Brett's other research takes him into epic Greek poetry and archaic poetry. So I'm interested to see if those connect in any way to our piece tonight. So without any more, Brett Stine.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And I feel I should clarify, I have a graduate certificate from Oxford, not a full-on degree. That would, no, yeah, as much as that would be wonderful. All right. So before I get started, I also have a few thank yous very quickly to give. So my first one is to the Remnant Trust and to Texas Tech University Libraries. Hopefully this actually goes. Come on. Yes. Yay. All right. For sponsoring this student scholar program. It's been a really great experience. It's not every day that you get to actually learn how to make an exhibit and have to put all the pieces together, do all the research behind it, get to work in a collection. Those are not things that are always readily accessible, and especially out here in West Texas. So it's a great opportunity to get to do that, a great experience to learn how to navigate those ropes, figure out that you can cut away a lot more text than you thought you could, because you always speak way more than you should, and that sort of thing. So that's been really great, and I'm really grateful, so thank you all for that. My other thank yous, and I've put all their names up here because I need lists or else I forget things. I want to thank the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. They're called CSNTM. You can find their website, csntm.org, and specifically their research manager, Rob Marcello, and their executive director, Dr. Daniel Wallace. They let me borrow this huge digitizing apparatus so that I could take really awesome pictures and show them all to you today. High res, like 18 megapixels and all of that kind of nerdy stuff. And they didn't have to let me do that, so I was really grateful. And I recommend checking them out if you're not familiar with them, because they've got beautiful images of Greek New Testament manuscripts up online, and you can leaf through all of them, you can read them like books, you can look at papyri, there's lots of fun stuff on there. I also want to thank Alex and Mallory. So this whole semester they have put up with me sort of invading their space every Thursday morning, demanding that I go back and see books multiple times. They've been putting together parts of the display that will go up this Thursday, from images to plaques to making sure that this thing got set up and all of that. So I'm just really grateful for y'all. Thank you for all your help. It's been a great way to be able to learn to do this sort of thing, a good environment for that. I wanted to thank Don Levine. He was my faculty advisor on this. He signed off on it so I could actually do it this semester. He gave me permission to do that among my many other things that I get to do in the classics department. And then I want to thank Bruce Kimmick. He's an assistant librarian here in the special collections. Bruce literally was involved in every part of the process of this, from making the sort of proposal back in October to the plaques that you'll see. He helped me pretty much cut everything out that was not needed, and did it very graciously in the process. So I just want to thank him. And then finally, Stacy Stine, my wife, who has graciously allowed me to take on yet another project in the 5 or 6 this semester. So thank you for your patience and willingness to let me do that. All right. So with that, I will get started. The title of my talk tonight is Ancient Authors, Sacred Fathers, and Peter Comestor's Historia Scholastica. And it's been a fun project. So I'm going to do, part of this is going to be me sort of like reading the formal paper thing. The other half of it is going to be me showing you lots of fun pictures because I think we have a bunch of really beautiful books here, and the reason you came here is not to look at me, it's to look at them. So the first half of this will kind of cover that. The second half, you'll actually get to, ooh and ah, and that'll be fun. So without further ado, here we go. All right. In his 2015 work on the Historia Scholastica, Mark Clark attempts to explain why such a famous medieval writer as Peter Comestor and such a famous work as the Historia Scholastica could fall through the cracks. Further, he wishes to resurrect Peter from the medieval tradition largely dominated by other 12th century theologians, such as Peter the Lombard, and give him his rightful place in the historiographic and theological tradition of medieval and early modern Western Europe. Admittedly, prior to my own application to the student scholarship program, I had very little knowledge of Comestor, though I am broadly trained in the humanities, and indeed my master's degree says that I am a master of the humanities. And I've spent a decent amount of time looking at the history, handwriting, and book culture of the medieval world. I've also come to find that my ignorance of Peter is not uncommon, as in fact most of the major encyclopedias on medieval Western Europe don't even mention his name. Clark, citing George Lacombe, remarks, quote, "There was a time when the Historia Scholastica was the most widely used book in Christendom. Today, it is a miracle to find anyone who has read it." And the big reason for that is it's not translated. And there's maybe one good critical edition. So it's really hard to even get a copy to read in the first place. While my aims are far more modest than Clark's, that is, I don't plan to resurrect Peter in any sort of way tonight, what I'd like to do is help you all appreciate Peter and his work, so give you sort of an overview of that, and then sort of show off the books and authors that seem to have inspired him to write his history. So with that in mind, I have two goals. First, I'm going to give you the context in which to understand the main book of the exhibit, a manuscript of the Historia Scholastica, and Peter. To do so, I will answer three questions. Who was Peter Comestor? What was the impact of the Historia Scholastica? And what sort of history is Peter writing? For the broader audience in the room, I hope this will prove informative enough to let you look at the books in the display and actually have an appreciation for their background and uniting threads. For the specialist or medievalist in the room, I hope this brief exploration of Peter Comestor and his Historia Scholastica can pique your interest in his work and perhaps give you reason to brush up on your Latin and pick up a copy, or come hang out with us in classics and we'll help you do it. Second, I want to showcase a set of beautiful and interesting manuscripts and books for you by highlighting pieces from the display and focusing in on some of their more noteworthy features. For this purpose, I will have many images on the screen, and in fact, this PowerPoint alone is like 2.3 gigs. It's quite amazing. So I'm going to have many images on the screen, as well as a few explanatory terms and a sort of guide to help you understand and appreciate each of the books. This will lead up to the end of the presentation, where after I will field some questions, you all can actually come over here to this space over here and interact with the books, look through them, flip through some of their pages, look at some of the features I've told you about, maybe find some of your own, because I'm not going to give you every page of every book, right? And while I don't expect that many of you will wish to dive down the rabbit hole of medieval Latin handwriting or paleography, what I hope is that this brief perusal will provide you with a greater appreciation for handwritten and early printed books and the book culture that sort of cultivates that. As a final caveat before we start, and has been stated, I want to clarify I'm not a medievalist by trade. Right? So I'm a classicist, which means I work in the world of Greece and Rome most of the time. And specifically, as Chris mentioned, I work in archaic poetry, which is sometimes far removed from things like the medieval world. But nevertheless, I've relied on a lot of many scholars, good scholars, to help me in this process and help me sort of summarize this stuff for you and bring it to you and make it accessible. And in particular, a gentleman named Mark Clark, He'll be in my bibliography at the end, but I wanted to give him a specific focus because he came out with this book in 2015 that's really comprehensive on the Historia Scholastica, and I think it gives a lot of insight into Peter and his program and what he's doing. So if you find Peter interesting, that's the place to start. Unfortunately, you might have to order it via our library because I don't think we have a copy here. I had to get it shipped to me. But nevertheless, it's a great addition in the scholarship, and I think you'll find it really helpful. So, let's get started. Oh, yay, more of these. So this is my first half of my presentation here, and those are the questions I'm answering. So, Peter Comestor was a 12th century French theologian and educator of great fame, specifically known for his widely used work, the Historia Scholastica, or the History. While little of his early life can be constructed with any degree of certainty, Peter was no doubt one of the most influential educators in the 12th century schools and early universities in and around Paris. His moniker, Comestor, is Latin and translates to something like eater or consumer. And it's usually explained by the broadly held opinion that Peter was a consumer of knowledge and thus insatiably learned. During his tenure as an educator, Peter served at two institutions in central and eastern France: the Cathedral of St. Peter's and the Cathedral of Notre Dame. St. Peter's was at Troyes, how do you say this? Troyes, where Peter served as dean of the cathedral church. And in Paris, Peter served at the famous Cathedral of Notre Dame as chancellor and dean of the cathedral school. This position provided Peter with the capacity to teach as chair of theology in the school, and seems to have been the fertile ground on which he began the Historia Scholastica. And you can see here with my apparently many arrows. This is true right here, and this is Paris over here. So this is sort of the French side of things. That way you've got a geography for thinking about Peter. Sometime after his retirement from the chair of theology, between 1169 and 1173, Peter completed and circulated the first edition of the Historia Scholastica. Peter died sometime between 1178 and 1180, but his personal fame continued, and he gained the designation of Magister Historiarum, which means the master of histories. Even into the late medieval and early modern periods, Peter's fame can be seen in such works as the Paradiso of Dante and a small entry and picture in the 1493 Nuremberg Chronicle, which was the picture that I showed you earlier of Peter's face. And this is a picture also from that Chronicle of Paris at the end of the 15th century, so it gives you a good idea. And in fact, this book is over there, so we can look at it here in a minute. During the mid-12th century, the medieval university was beginning to form. It was the result of people traveling to get an education. And in Peter's day, the primary role of both the school and the university was to educate clergy and administrators. Much like the academics of today, there were some who provided more esoteric or closed-off approaches to theology, as well as there were those that were considered more accessible and practical. Peter's work, and especially the Historia Scholastica, seems to have fallen into the accessible camp, a point I'm going to return to here in a little bit. As early as 1173, the Historia Scholastica was already in use in medieval schools, evidenced in the Chronicle of Robert of Alher, and served as a highly influential work on the Dominican and Franciscan orders of the Catholic Church. Additionally, as Clark has noted, many copies of the Historia Scholastica in the medieval period are reported to come from other orders or canons as well, including the Augustinians, the Benedictines, the Calamedolensians, the Carthusians, and the Cistercians. So in short, what this means is that the Historia Scholastica was not only used in schools, but was also copied and dispersed across medieval monasteries of Western Europe as a resource to be used in theological and personal study, as well as to edify and educate congregations or everyday people. The Historia Scholastica continued to have a long life after the 12th century, evidenced by the over 800 written manuscripts extant between the 12th and 16th centuries. And just to give you sort of a context for that, one of our other authors tonight, Josephus, that we've got a copy of, he was a really famous author he had a Latin translation of his work because he originally wrote in Greek, but his Latin translation was used all over the medieval world in Western Europe. And we only have 146 known manuscripts of his. verses 800. So we've got a lot of copies of Peter, which means that he was a really frequently used guy, and his work was really important then. The Historia Scholastica eventually made its way out of the university and pulpit and down to the everyday person, especially through the medieval popular Bible. As Morey states, it served as the single most important medium through which a popular Bible took shape, that is, the Historia Scholastica did, from the 13th to the 15th century in France, in England, and elsewhere. In particular, Peter's Historia Scholastica made a huge impact on late medieval and early Renaissance movements to translate the Latin Bible and relevant accompanying literature into the vernacular languages of Europe. A prime example of this is actually the manuscript that we have on display tonight, manuscript 727. It's a handwritten copy of the Historia Scholastica, made in 1450 from Windesheim, Germany, and is believed to be part of the Devotia Moderna movement, which was a major proponent of translating and teaching the scriptures and theological text in the languages of the common people. Finally, the Historia Scholastica can be found in printed volumes from 1471 up until 1728, when it seems to have dwindled in its perceived significance. So up till about the 18th century, it sort of then takes a dive, and we don't really see it pop up much. So to summarize, Peter was a 12th century theologian in France. He served as a notable teacher in Troyes and Paris, and created a famous work called the Historia Scholastica, which had a significant impact on Western Europe from the 12th to the 18th centuries. So that's the sort of context we can envision Peter and his work in. So now what I want to do is give you a sense of what the work actually is, right? So not just its impact, but what sort of thing is Peter writing? And here's my quick little summary, right? That way you can grab the highlights if you'd like them. Right? So I'd like to consider now the nature of the Historia Scholastica, or to put it another way, I'd like to define what sort of history Peter wrote. Now, it's not my intention tonight to debate various ideas of history that might come up. While I think the fields of the philosophy of history and historiography are very important, my intention is to describe the Historia Scholastica by Peter's own definition of the project, which he named a Historia. He named it a history, so I think that's really significant. It seems most natural then to me to lay out for you at first how he constructed his history from two angles. One is the sources of his content, and the other is the function of the content in his work. So who's he using and how is he using it, right? At the base, the Historia Scholastica is a summary of what would today be considered the Hebrew Bible, including not only the Torah or the Pentateuch, but also selections of other canonical or authoritative books coming from the writings of the Ketuvim and the prophets or the Nevi'im. And I've got a list of all those books up here for you so you can get an idea. He didn't obviously do every single book of the Hebrew Bible, but he's got a good selection here, and you can get a sense of that. Additionally, he also used texts from the Apocrypha, so Tobit and 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and the Gospels of the Christian New Testament. These summaries were arranged in a chronological order, in contrast to the way the Hebrew Bible is set up, right? Because it's not chronological. You have sections of it put together, and then the different sections sort of split. So you kind of have to piece it together for yourself or have a really good timeline in front of you, right? And Peter seems to be the really good timeline. And he set these up in a clear narrative, beginning with creation in Genesis and proceeding all the way on up to the resurrection of Jesus. Additionally, Peter realized that though the canon of Scripture was considered authoritative, nevertheless, it occasionally included gaps in the historical record or could benefit by supplements from other parts of the ancient world necessary to contextualize the story of Israel and subsequently Jesus and the rise of Christianity. Here, Peter turned to the authors of the Greek and Roman traditions to complement his work, including authors displayed tonight, such as the poet Ovid and his Metamorphoses, various works of the Roman orator Cicero, who was also just popular in general in the Latin Western Europe, and especially the Jewish author and Roman official of the 1st century CE, Josephus, in his Jewish Antiquities. Peter also worked in a much longer tradition of Christianity and subsequently utilized ancient and more contemporary church fathers and theologians to complement his narrative, including St. Augustine of Hippo, who is arguably the most influential church father in the medieval period in the West. all the way up to his contemporary and friend Peter the Lombard, both of which are also on display tonight, and I'll be showing you some of the pages of them. They're very wonderful books. So perhaps a way to put this into a contemporary setting is to consider a modern example. If any of you have ever attended a college or high school history course, or been present for a Sunday school class or at synagogue where someone has attempted to cover a large, complicated amount of historical content spanning a broad stretch of time, you understand the desire and need to skillfully summarize the content. Additionally, if you've ever read through the sacrificial laws of Leviticus, or tried to create a timeline in the book of Ezekiel, or thought long and hard about the Genesis accounts of creation, you know the challenge that comes with trying to grasp the who, what, when, where, and why, and so might also see the need to supplement your readings with other sources that provide context and aid for that. The Historia Scholastica then can be understood as an attempt to make the narrative of the Hebrew Bible and Christian New Testament accessible by creating a natural flow of events in a compressed and approachable form, much like large history books that we have today, right, that really select out what they think is most important and put it in an order that we can all grab and understand. So that way we get the big picture, and then we can dive into the little pieces if we want to. We can also consider what sort of thing the history, or what sort of history the Historia Scholastica is, by placing it in its immediate historical and theological context and comparing it to another medieval theological work, the Book of Sentences by Peter Lombard. Peter Lombard was a 12th century theologian who taught in Paris at Notre Dame a decade before Comestor, and who wrote this really influential work called The Sentences that stood at the core of the medieval university curriculum and even heavily influenced the Historia Scholastica itself. Lombard's sentences consisted of individual theological questions, which provided multiple answers to each question from the scriptures and broader Christian tradition, and then often landed on a right answer, or the answer that Lombard, whoever was working through the tradition, thought was close to accurate. In modern parlance, we might consider Lombard's sentences a sort of systematic theology, or maybe a trees approach to the content of the Christian theological education, right? Answering individual questions, but not necessarily trying to tie together broad narrative themes or trying to get a historical view. In contrast, Peter tells us in his prologue to the Historia Scholastica that he took up the project at the insistent entreaty of my colleagues, who, because they would often read the history of the sacred scripture scattered in the scriptural text and glosses, too concise and insufficiently explained, pressed me to compose a work to which they might have resource for grasping the truth of history. End quote. One can envision the sentences, and here's a nice little copy of it. I think it'll put it up on the screen here. You can see his work here, and I'll come back to this image in a minute, but I just wanted to show it off, because why not? So one can imagine that Peter has the sentences in his mind when he's thinking about this, right? Snippets of scripture, but no clear grouping together. And while things like the sentences serve a highly important purpose for medieval theological education, they fail to present a clear chronological progression of events of the scriptures. Elsewhere, Peter lays out a vision of his Historia as a cohesive history, which assumes the need to impose a clear chronological progression upon his content and assumes their historical accuracy, supplementing content where necessary with relevant ancient and medieval materials. So to put that really simply, he's taking his content, he assumes it's correct, and he's putting it in an order that he thinks makes logical sense of the broader sort of timeline. Right? In spite of their differences, the Historia Scholastica was viewed not as antithetical to Lombard's sentences, but in fact complementary. And if Lombard is somewhat analogous to our idea of systematic theology, we might then envision the Historia Scholastica, as Clark has suggested, as an attempt at historical theology. That is to say, the text is constructed in a clear chronological progressing narrative that makes the historical content simultaneously digestible and accessible. Or to keep with the analogy, it's the forest rather than the trees. So a good summary then of what the history is can be seen here, and I've kind of tried to put it all together, right? So it imposes clear chronological narrative on its content. It assumes its historical accuracy in terms of the primary source, which is the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, and it supplements all of that with this relevant ancient and medieval work in order to help give context and create clarity. So that way it makes this biblical narrative that is both digestible, accessible, reachable, right? Which is why it makes sense that it was also very popular, right, with people who maybe didn't have the background to know all that information and would need something like that, as well as people studying in seminary and that sort of thing. So now I hope you have a good sort of sense of who Peter is and what the Historia Scholastica is and why it's important. So there's a lot more that could be said on these topics, and indeed I've got a nice little bibliography at the end that I would gladly point any of you to if you find this terribly fascinating. But what I want to turn to tonight is really the highlight of the night, the manuscripts and books themselves. And so for the remainder of the talk, I will focus my attention on the manuscripts that will be used and that are on display that you'll get to look at here at the end. And what I want to do is give you a brief overview of each of them, point out a few things that I think are really interesting or maybe worthwhile to look at or might pique your interest personally. And I'll give you some vocabulary with which to think about it. So I'm going to define a few key bits, because one of the things about studying things like manuscripts and handwriting is we use a lot of jargon, and everyone assumes that everyone else knows what it means. Which is never a good thing to do. So I'm going to try to not do that in any way, shape, or form. So I'm going to give you a few key terms, and then I'm just going to kind of show off some really nice pictures and point out some things to you before I take some questions. So, key terms, and I've pulled all these from this book, Clemens and Graham, because they were very clear, and I actually brought that book tonight. We own a copy of it in the library, and so I just thought it would be fun to put here because it's a whole introduction to manuscript studies, and so if you find this sort of thing fascinating, or you happen to be a student who maybe is wanting to get more into this, it's a really accessible book. It makes for a great way to sort of like dive in, and then it provides you with a lot of good background in the process. So the key things I'm going to talk about tonight, the first one is an initial. And no, this isn't like putting your name down, right? What it is initial is usually a larger letter on the page that sets off a new paragraph or a new thought in the work. And these can be simple things like just sort of in red ink as opposed to black ink and a little bit larger. They can be a little more flourished, and so have some additional little things drawn on them. Or they can be what's called historiated, which means that they've taken the letter, made it rather large, and put some kind of image into it, usually, whether that's a human or some kind of plant, or I think we even have like one of like maybe a satyr or something in the Lombard manuscript, like holding a spear or something like that. So there's some different ones that you can look at as you go through these. The next bit is rubrication, and all this means is that in the text, where we would normally use sort of maybe a bold thing to make something stand out as here's the next section, they use red ink. And so anywhere through here, you'll see sort of these like bits that are sort of like a title maybe almost for the next section. That's rubrication, and you'll see it all through lots of manuscripts from the medieval period. So from here on out, when you look at a medieval manuscript, you will know what's going on. Another great term just to know is incunabula. This is any printed book that's before 1500. And so it's just a fancy name to sort of distinguish that from anything post 1500, which is probably slightly arbitrary in terms of time frame. But hey, what do you do? That's what manuscript people do. We have to create time frames. All right, four more things. We have ruling, and how many of you have ever used wide-ruled paper? Great. So you know what ruling is then. They're both the horizontal and vertical lines that create the space on the page, right? And so you can see this in medieval manuscripts as much as you can see it on your 8x11.5 that you used whenever you were in school, or maybe yesterday or today. Right? And that sort of thing is they either used like metal sort of like tipped ends where they would press down hard on the paper, or parchment. Or they even used like lead lines, things like that. So there's a couple of things here. Here, it's mostly, it seems like it was the hard-tipped steel ends or iron ends. But illumination, and these are the ones that everyone loves, the illuminated manuscripts. This is just really brightly colored sort of illustrations that are built into the manuscript. They can often be a part of these historiated initials, and they often have silver or gold leafing put on them. So what that means is that usually for most places they require someone else besides the scribe to actually put this sort of thing on. So there's a whole industry to making a manuscript, right? Someone makes the actual manuscript itself, the pages, they put them together. Someone actually does the writing. Someone does the illustrating. So there's a lot of different processes that go into that, and this is one of them. Final two. Marginalia, and I separate this from something like commentary, that it's on paper and it's considered illustrated. So a couple of fun things. This is the opening page, and I'm going to like step away from the... Can everyone hear me? Are we good? Great. Okay. So just to point out some of the things we just talked about, you'll notice this is what we would call a historiated initial. So within the letter itself, they've created some kind of like, vegetative or organic coloring where you've got blue, red, green sort of in here. You can also see that they've flourished the outside of the letter. However, they haven't actually finished all of it, which is sort of interesting. We don't see that in all the other letters in the rest of the book. So for some reason, the first letter on the first page doesn't get done and everything else does, and I'm not quite sure why. Other things to point out, you'll notice the red markers here, right? So our rubrication, the things telling us where we're breaking up new sections of text. So, and you'll also notice that actually this author has put red throughout. And I think what he's doing is trying to mark out sort of for the eye how to follow the progression of what's going on in terms of the actual text. Because this is throughout this whole book. Other things to notice, commentary over here, which seems to have been copied alongside with the book because we have lots of pages of this, and I'll show you a couple of other ones. So again, distinct from the marginalia that I was bringing up earlier. And it seems to coordinate, I'm trying to remember which bit it is. I want to say it's coordinating here, but I could be wrong. Yeah, I think that's right. So that's the opening page. Again, this next page, you can see initials, rubrication, right? You see where this is going. It gets easy to notice it after a while. Commentary built in. My favorite thing about this page is the map, right? So we've got Europe, Asia here. So this is a cosmos, right? This is a geography of thinking about the world from the mid-15th century, which I find fascinating. Cosmology is one of my favorite things. So thinking about how the world is ordered and works. And so for whoever is copying this, apparently it's really relevant in the early part here where we're summarizing Exodus, where we're summarizing Exodus to actually think about where everything is in the geography of space. So he's got this nice cosmological thing here that we'll see something like it a little bit later too in a book of Ovid. So it's kind of fun. And then finally, one of my favorite pages. So we've got a little bit of diversity in our initials here, and even a blue one. And the red and blue seems to be pretty characteristic of the mid-15th century. When we look at Peter Lombard next, he's got pretty much the same color pattern. We've also got a copy of Thomas Aquinas out there that's pretty close within 100 years of both of those being copied, and it's also got the red-blue scheme. So this is a pretty common sort of thing. My favorite bit that I don't know what to do with is this thing here that I've blown up for you. It looks like some kind of like maybe human thing that's got like arms and legs and kind of doing. Bruce and I spent a while staring at this and trying to figure out what it means, and I still have no idea. But I find it fascinating, and it sort of gets scribbled in over here, and even slightly like thatch decorated over here. So it's quite beautiful. But yeah, so have fun. Go try and find it, please, when you come check this out. Right. So the next one I want to look at is Peter Lombard's Book of Sentences. This is from his first book, copied in southern Germany, so similar place about 10 years before our Book of Comestor. Also illustrated, also on paper. So this is Lombard's Sentences. This is the opening page. You'll notice similarities between what we just saw, so the blue and red initials, the red here showing us rubrication. The fun bits on this one are actually the historiated initials. So can anyone guess who that might be? Yes. So this is probably King David sitting with his harp. And there are other ones throughout the book. One of the really nice ones as you go further in is there's a image of the dove descending and the 12 apostles sort of sitting around. That's really nice. And then there's some of like some naked guys fighting with like a sword and a spear, and it's kind of weird, kind of grotesque. I don't know how it made it in here, but it's kind of fun. The other thing to notice here is you actually see these little scribbles out here in the margins down here. So I would call this marginalia as opposed to commentary, right? These look like they've been little bits that people have written in as ways to make notes to themselves, to talk about certain things. They even sort of scribble over lines. And I would also, I guess, point you to how compressed the hand is, right? Look, we've got 2 columns on here. It's sort of really tight, kind of hard to read. And even if you're someone who knows Latin paleography decently, it's still hard to read. It gets challenging. I wanted to show you this page and one other page before I move on, because I think it's kind of unique and fascinating. So you can see the red rubrication here. You can see the initials, but then you see this like scribbling along the outside. Can anyone guess what that is? No, not commentary. So apparently the scribe missed a whole page. And you can partially tell this because he's still using the rubrication to designate the sections. And so what he did is he put it in the margins. And you know, this isn't all that uncommon. That is to say, when people are putting books together, you have sections of books. And if you've ever actually stared at the books you make, right, it's not like one big folded paper over another over another. It's what we would call gatherings or quires. And so probably what happened is he missed a quire, right? He missed where it was supposed to go in that particular bit. So he had to go back in and fill it in. So it went all the way around, and then it actually made it into the bottom of the next page down here. And again, you can see like the markings of the red to keep the eye, so you can sort of tell that he's still doing that thing, and it's different from, say, some of the scribbling over here that's just kind of tiny. So, yeah, I thought that was great. Poor guy. Nope. Oops, sorry. Onward. Great, okay. So this next book, I'm only going to show you one page, and in fact, we aren't able to have it out today because its binding is having to be redone. It's in a bit of a bad shape for that. But I did want to put one leaf of it because Josephus, our author here, is so influential in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, and so I think it's worth getting to pull it up. And the book itself is sort of interesting, is just thinking about it in terms of a modern analog even. So here's the title page of it. You can see he's quite the famous and memorable works of Josephus, right? Very laudable, apparently. Translated both from Latin and from French, right? So we're actually, if you think about it, we're now 4 stages removed from Josephus. So Josephus writes in Greek, and then he gets translated into Latin. He gets translated into French. He gets translated into English. So we're four steps away from that, which as a classicist makes me cringe, but as a book lover makes me think, wow, that's fascinating. Other things that are sort of fun, it was made in London. The book itself, if you work through it, what you find is that at the very front, he's actually got a lot of tables and mentions of like dates, names of months, how to think about how weights work. So when you're reading through Josephus, you actually can make sense of all that stuff that pops up, and you don't just have to gloss over it and think, well, that was nice. He's also, he does kind of what you might think of with maybe a modern like study Bible or something like that. He puts scriptural like echoes into the like cross references into the margins. And so as you flip through it, you can actually sort of like follow along whenever it coordinates with both the Hebrew Bible, the Christian New Testament, and I think you might even have some like classical authors as well that sort of pop up here and there. So it's a fun and interesting thing to look at from the modern period. Oh, our next manuscript, yay. All right, so this one's beautiful. I'm really excited for this, and I hope you all will stop and actually go stare at this one for quite a while. So it's a copy of Cicero, several of his orations. This is a very clean and nice manuscript, and I'll even point you first just to like the handwriting. You can actually read it. So whoever copied this had a really nice, what we would call a book hand, as opposed to maybe a more cursive hand. You can see it's still got cursive elements, but it's very clear. It's easy to read. It's easy to work through. You can also actually see on this the ruling, right? So if you notice over here, you can actually see the lines and how hard they've been pressed and how clear it is. So you can see and follow what the scribe is writing and how straight he actually wrote it. The other thing, and this is true throughout the whole manuscript, is that you'll notice the historiated initial over here is rather beautiful. And the colors, which I find fascinating, are pretty complex compared to some of the other ones we've seen. We've mostly seen green, blue, red. Here you can see there's actually sort of a blending of colors. It's not just like a clear red. It's not just a clear green. It's not just a clear blue. We've got sort of a pinky purple thing going on, right? And it's also got gold leaf on it. So if you look right over in here, someone has had to go in and actually put gold leaf on. And I don't know if you've ever seen someone do this. If not, you should go check this out on YouTube. But it's quite complicated because you have to sort of deal with all the different pieces and then try to make sure that you don't ruin what someone else just did. Because you probably would have filled in this bit first and then had either done the gold leaf later or had someone else do the gold leaf later. So it creates layers in the process. So even though it seems like a small, compact letter, it takes a lot of work to make it happen. Let me see, I think I have one other one from this manuscript that I really like. Yes. Okay, good. So this page is a little less elegant, and you'll notice we've got the red letters over marking sort of our new sections, right? So rubrication. But you'll also notice down here in the corner, this one word. Can anyone guess why you might put a word down in the bottom left corner or bottom right corner of a page? Not quite. Good guess though. Yes, good. So one of the strategies to not have the problem of our scribe who wrote things and missed things is that if you know you're ending a particular gathering of text and you've got another one that needs to start with it, you put the word down here that the next one starts with. So that way when you're trying to sew them all together, you don't have that issue. So it becomes really helpful in terms of actually putting things in their proper order. And I have seen multiple manuscripts where they were sewn in the wrong order. They didn't use this method, so it's helpful. Right. Okay, so we've got two more left, and then questions. So this one is, I'm going to focus on Ovid, but this is called a Sammelbound book, and what that means is that multiple books have actually been bound together. But yeah, so you've got, what it is the first, I think, 4 lines of the Metamorphoses, and then you've got all this commentary, and then you've got marginalia out here. So the book has been intentionally printed to have all of that sort of stuff with it. And you can see that the person, whoever read it, has actually interacted with the commentary a bit. They've got things underlined over here. And we'll see more of this here in a second, as well as up here. So you can kind of get an idea of how people interact with their printed books. So I don't know, do you all write in your books? Is that a thing? Some of you don't, some of you do. I get like head nods. Okay, yeah, so I write in my books all the time. I underline things all the time. I write things in margin all the time. And I wonder if they make it into any type of existence, who's actually going to read that and think, what the heck were they talking about? But you can see that people are doing the same sort of thing, and we've seen that in our handwritten books as well as in our copied books. But now you've got another layer on it, right? Because someone else is writing about Ovid, and you're writing about someone else writing about Ovid. So it's an interesting thing to think about. And the other bit I wanted to point out here, we've got another map of the cosmos, right? And this is taken from about, I don't know, the first 200-300 lines of Ovid. At some point, he sort of walks us through the universe that he's created and tells us where all the places are and how hot they are and how cold they are and what constellations are where and so on and so forth. And so you can actually see that here sort of laid out in a nice cosmological wheel. And what I like most about this, because I'm a Hellenist, is that there's Greek on it. And so what that means is that when they printed this, they would have had to set up the Latin letter type and the Greek letter type and printed it all together, because it would be far too expensive to try to print it in 2 separate goes, and it would take way too much time. So whoever set this up had to deal with that. And actually in a lot of the commentary, there are Greek bits. There's reference to Greek work, which is fun and interesting, because really mostly Greek stuff would not have been in Western Europe until about 100 years before this. We have Constantinople fall, and we get some stuff just before that a little bit, but you have all these people fleeing from Byzantium. So it's fascinating to think about. I like it. And our final book that I'm going to focus on tonight is from a copy of Augustine's City of God, bound with his treatise on the Trinity. And again, it's from late 15th century, and it's printed, but it's illuminated and rubricated, which means that someone printed the text and then went back through and actually decorated it. So, and I think it's probably got the most elaborate letters we've got in the whole thing, even though it's a printed text. So you'll notice that the letter is highly stylized. We've got the gold leafing. We've got lots of different colors, even going down into like the tail, right? He started to like blend the colors more, and it's sort of different with these little like fruits or something hanging off of them, whatever those are. So I think this letter, it's beautiful. And this is the front page. I think it's actually already open over here. And then you can see, again, it's got a similar setup kind of to the Ovidian thing, as well as it's got some notes in the margins. This next page helps to, I think, lay it out. So with Ovid, we had sort of one column, right, and then like the commentary all around it. You'll notice it's got a similar setup, but we've got 2 columns. So if we were to put our orange brackets in again, here's the main text. Here's the commentary going around it. And a fun feature about this manuscript is when they want to really mark out what goes with what, they give them opposite colors. So blue goes with red on almost every page. And I'll show you another page here in a second that illustrates it really well. But also you'll notice we've got, I want to say 1, 2, 3. So we've got at least 3 different people marking in the margins, 3 different hands. And then we've got our nice little manicula right up here. So this little pointer finger telling us that apparently there is something important at that very spot. So just to highlight this again, you can see blue, red correspond, red, blue, blue, red. And then just because I like them, these fingers over here. The top one reminds me kind of the Grinch, that like cartoon, if you're familiar with it. And then we can also see, again, some bigger hands out here and some little notes. So whoever is reading this copy of Augustine is really interested in interacting with it and its commentary, which I just adore. So with that, I will take questions. Yes?
Can you go back to that last map of the cosmos?
Maybe. Let me see if it'll let me. Oh, yes, it will. Yay. The one from Ovid? Yeah. We'll get there eventually.
Okay. So the date of this book is what?
It was 1505, I believe.
Okay. So does this depict the entire universe? Does it depict the Earth? Is it meant to show a flat Earth or a globular Earth? What do you think?
I don't think it's concerned with flat Earth or globular. I think its concern is probably just illustrating what Ovid has said. So Ovid specifically sort of takes you through the entirety of the cosmos. He walks you around it, and he lays out all the key features in the early part of Metamorphoses, Book 1.
If you look at the inner circle, it has what looks like the climactic zones.
Yes.
Cold at the top, temperate, and then hard in the middle. So that kind of suggests that it's showing you what the climactic zones of the Earth are, and they're kind of in their proper order. up
Yeah, yeah.
there. You have 2 poles and all that.
Right.
So I'm wondering how it related to all the rest of it.
Great question. Well, so this is specifically how Ovid characterizes the living zones. So he tells you that there are 2 very cold places. He tells you that you can sort of live in these like medium temperate zones, but then if you go to the very, very center, it's way too hot. And that's sort of where the Ethiopians live on the edge of that, and Ovid's Cosmos, that sort of thing. So that's where you get that sort of thing from. As far as the other stuff around it goes, essentially he's sort of giving you the winds, and he's telling you where they're coming from and how they then relate to actually coming into this the areas here. So let me see if I can find a really good example of this. Where's my good? Yes, good. Okay, so Boreas comes in and Thracian comes in, and so this is probably more of a northerny sort of thing, because Thrace is thought to be sort of north and away and other, and things cold come from there. Versus if you've got like Austere coming in, or where's our other really good one? I'm trying to see if I can find I guess Urus. No.
He's calling Zephyrus Favonius over the top.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, he is. Yeah, Favonius. So this would be like the west wind coming in, yeah. So the nice one. But I don't know that it's, I don't think it's really oriented very well. So, and I don't think that's really the intention.
He has what looks like a astrological symbols. Is that right up in the upper left?
Here?
Is that Greek? Yeah, that's very
We're
top.
here.
Is that Greek?
That's Greek.
Okay.
Yes.
What does that say?
Hips, which, do you know what hips is?
No idea.
I have no idea. That's like not a word that I've ever seen. And I don't know that it actually is a word. It could be transliterated of something, but I don't know. I haven't really thought that long and hard about it. So, so I don't know if that's helpful to you, but
No, it is.
yeah. Great. Any other questions?
There was one page where we had text, 2 boxes of text in the middle,
Mm-hmm.
and then we had all the commentary around.
Mm-hmm.
Now, did that text read from left to right completely across both boxes, or did you go to the bottom of the first box and the back?
So you would read down and then go up, read down. Yeah, so left to right, all the way, and each section is sort of its own thing, and then the commentary around it is just talking specifically about that bit. Yeah, so that's how we would have, and I think you were thinking of probably this, if we can ever get there again.
And is that letter
Which one?
the elegant?
Oh, the elegant one.
I can't tell.
No, I think it's actually, I think it might be an A, an odd A, coming across and then up and over, and the bottom is base, from light. Yeah, so aluminia. Yeah. Any other?
People leave their names in the book, their autograph.
I didn't see any autographs. Mostly just like little notes or questions, or occasionally someone. My favorite, I didn't actually get to put this book in the display, but there's a copy of Boethius. He's a philosopher from late antiquity. And someone's like, Plato says he's wrong in the base. So I enjoyed reading some of that, these little jabs at the author who can't actually talk back, except for, I guess, in his work.
At what point did these books no longer have been chained and had to be read as supervision?
I don't know that this book
Would be
would be, specifically because it's got so much writing in it. So it seems to be a bit more public and accessible than, say, maybe that Cicero that we saw that doesn't really have that sort of thing. That one was probably kept a lot more under lock and key and kept in much better condition for, you know, its aesthetics. And yeah, and it is interesting. I mean, you've got like this really fancy sort of work throughout the Augustine book, but there's scribbling all over the place. People are interacting with it. So the context of it, and there's multiple hands, so multiple people are doing it. So I don't know if that means that there's like 2 or 3 people in the house who are like leaving each other's notes as they're writing, or if it means that someone's inheriting it and then adding to the commentary around itself, right? Like adding notes to notes, that sort of thing. So.
You mentioned little bits of Greek and that's a lot. Did Comester or Lombard refer to original texts in the Hebrew or Greek original?
Hebrew, yes, and there's a great article. I don't have it in my bibliography, but there's a great article on Comestor's use of actual, like, the Masoretic text. Greek, I don't think so. I don't think they knew Greek. Or if they did, it was very tangentially because that wasn't part of the training. They worked mostly with the Vulgate. And so Greek was kind of off the radar. So, yes?
What are the marks on the right edge the vertical scribbles?
Oh, these.
Yeah.
I think they're actually doing what I do, which is they're marking out a whole section that they want to pay attention to, and then making a comment about that section by marking it clearly. So this is what I'm talking about, X. So I think that's what's going on with that bit of sort of scribbling down the line. And I should have done this, but you can see down here where something similar is happening. And then here, when he puts this out, this is actually underlined. So it seems like that might be a consistent way of handling it. And now that you pointed it out, I need to go back and look at it a lot more because I'm thinking about it. Yes?
Okay, so some of these, as even you admitted, are very hard to read. How many hours do you have to stare at Comastar's text before you can read 80% of the letters?
Oh, gosh. I feel like it takes like probably, if you want to read it, you probably have to come in and sit every day and do it for, like, I don't know, a month at least to get to where you can, and that's just for Comestor, right? Because for those of you that don't know, Latin paleography or Latin handwriting is very, very diverse. We have lots of different versions of it. Greek is much easier to learn because pretty much we don't know where any book came from, so we say they all come from Byzantium. And then essentially it's all written in a fairly similar hand. So you don't have a lot of variation in Greek in the way that you do in Latin, but Latin builds up out of these regions, right, in Europe. And so you've got lots of different hands that go from anywhere from Germany to England down to Spain up through France. And they can be distinguished by their regions, but then actually learning how to read them, you sort of have to not completely relearn paleography every time you do it, but you have to work a whole lot harder to get used to it, which is why I like reading Greek papyri a lot more than just about anything else. But, yeah.
So if you were in a university someplace in Europe, would the manuscripts that you'd be reading, you're a scholar, would they be written pretty much in the same hand, or would they be a mixture of hands?
Like today or
No,
back then? My guess is they would have a fairly similar look to them. We do have scribes who actually travel, and we know that because we can trace sort of their paths. And so when that happens, you can actually see if you've got a scribe coming from somewhere else into another place because it doesn't look like anybody else's stuff, right? And then you have like the trouble of, so for instance, my handwriting is awful. They would not pay me to write like a nice book, right? But they might let me like scribble down a student copy, whereas they would pay my wife, who knows calligraphy, to actually write the nice book. And so you can sort of start to find those things. So it works up to a point, that is to say, when things are really nicely done, you can sort of really pinpoint where they're coming from. And even in things that are a little lower in quality, you can sort of grade. But then when you get to things like documentary hands and daily notes, it all goes out the window. And the only way we can do those well is that we can actually find dates and names and things. That's what helps us there, as opposed to the literary hands.
To what extent in this period was spelling standardized even in Latin or Greek?
Great question. In Greek, you can mostly see it standardized. That is to say, you'll have a few people who don't nail things perfectly, and the things that have problems are like the vowels alpha and eta that cause a lot of our variations in manuscripts, that sort of thing. In Latin, I'm not entirely sure, because I tend to work with like a specific manuscript for a while and then another one for a while. So I don't always think about how standardized they are. I just learn whatever it is for that one. But that's a great question. Sorry I don't have an answer, but I'll definitely look into it because I kind of want to know.
I think that'll be it. Let's thank Brett again. Absolutely. You guys are welcome to come take a look at some of the